were thinking about all the political activities at the time. The Occupy was happening everywhere around the world, and we were doing this wonderful aesthetic exhibition and had nothing to do with it. And in the same time, all the movement all around the world, Arab Spring, everyone used theatrical means, for their purposes. And I realized that it's somehow important to address that theater is a political place, that it's a place where living people meet. And that it's one of the last places on the planet where living people meet. In some countries people go to church still, but in a lot of countries people don't, go to religious gatherings anymore. So theater is one of those places, for social interaction in a way. And I also followed another thought, and that is that the theater has changed in the last 20-30 years, and that's mainly theater doesn't happen only in the theater, in the buildings made for theater, where the stage and auditorium are separate, but it happens in the streets, in everyday spaces, in public spaces, in semi-public spaces, in found spaces, and so on. And usually in those stages, in those found stages, the division between auditorium and stage doesn't exist, and the audience is actually part of the stage space. So in that sense, it's a shared space twice. It's a shared space of the community, of the society, but it's also a shared space between the performance and the auditorium. And I thought that was one of the most important changes in the recent theatrical practice, and we wanted to look into that. While we did previous projects and the previous European projects, I always thought were much more centralized, were much more done by us, by the Quadrennial. This time I decided to give more freedom to the partners, because over the course of years I realized that different countries have very different needs, and then that sometimes I'm implanting some ideas that are needed in Czech Republic but are completely unnecessary in Estonia or in Spain and so on. So for this time we did a decentralized project, so the theme was the same and the means were the same. We did workshops and symposia and performances in public spaces, published books and so on, but each partner could decide what's really necessary for their local needs and what their theater environment and their theater community needs to do. So for instance, in Latvia and in Poland they did a lot of workshops because they needed to do much more groundwork, much more educational things, while other like Sant'Arcangelo did a much more public thing, and there's actually a school also. I was really surprised by Victoria and Albert Museum's proposal. They did this interactive installation video in which you could never see the scenography on stage, but you could constantly see the scenography of the community, of those thousands and hundreds of thousands of people that are there, people jump, watching a concert in the mud, the toilets, how they live, all the tents where they live, and so that was a really amazing experience. So I think a lot of those projects explored the environment, architectural, spatial environment, but also the community environment and how that influences performance. And we, the Quadrennial, did two, in my opinion, very interesting projects. In 2013, we did a project about masking, and we did a symposium, a 2-day symposium where everybody was masked throughout the symposium, all the speakers and the moderators and everyone. It was a nice exercise in theatricality, in practice.
And everyone was making their own mask, or they're coming up with it on their own?
Some of them made them themselves, some of them borrowed them. It was very, very, very strange. My favorite time was when there were 2 people completely in golden and the moderator had a sock on his head. But to be honest,
brutal.
But by the end of the second day, we all started taking off the mask because it was very hard to breathe. It was very hard to speak. But it was really fun for the first day, and then And another project that we did that I think is very important for the whole shared space is in 2014 we did a project, spatial curation, where we played with the seating. And we were looking into the way the seating of the symposium is organized, you know, starting off with very hierarchical, the speaker and the audience, and then we made two sides, and then we made the round until all the chairs mingled together and everybody was mixed, the speakers and the people who discussed and so on. And
so what did you find?
And we found out that people really discuss better in a de-hierarchized theatrical space. That when there is no division, a complete mix. When you couldn't, yeah.
So getting away from any kind of formation, essentially, when it becomes a little bit chaotic.
Yeah, everybody felt more free to discuss. Yeah,
that's interesting.
And it really worked. And I think that was one of the core exercises of the shared space, is to see how the spacing itself creates the relating of people and performance and so on. There's one more project that is one of my favorite parts of the shared space project, and that is a series of what we call retreats. And it's a group residency that we created for groups of 5 to 10, 15 people. And the idea was that a curating artist, an artist we invited first, which was Motus from Italy, chose people they want to spend 4 days with. And they didn't have to be people they know, but it was artists that they admired and thought they could have exchange with, artists, scientists, it didn't matter. And we did 4 of those. The first one was in Veles in Macedonia, then it was in Finland, then in Latvia, and finally in Czech Republic a few months ago. And the idea of that project was to provide a space for artists just to talk and just to think, you know, and not to think about the end product, not to talk about a specific agenda or specific project, you know, but to see what they have in common and what they're doing. Because we were thinking, you know, earlier in history there were artist salons, you know, people would just sit and chat, you know, and somehow the culture was coming from under up. And we had a feeling that nowadays the culture is happening from the top down, that somebody makes up a topic, somebody says which projects will get the money, and then the producers, you know, implant those topics on the artists. So we wanted to create this open space for artists. And we're very proud of that project, and it seems it's going to continue happening in Czech Republic.
So the non-formal, the ability to be closer, non-hierarchical, because I remember when I was reading about it, one of the big things that stood out was the non-hierarchical, and I think that's in contrast to what we see in schools, where you really do have the teachers and you do have a clear hierarchy, which I'm not saying is not important, but it's different. And in this space lab you had more or less non-hierarchical approach to certain workshops.
I somehow took it for granted, and I think one has to be much more careful with that idea, because some parts of theatrical culture is still very hierarchical. In opera or in big drama theater you have very strong hierarchies and very strict authorities, so that cannot be broken just like that. But in the new forms of theater, in site-specific device theater, performance, and so on, that's not an issue anymore. It's mainly about collaborative work and devising together. But I think I realized that those worlds are actually still very, very separate, and I think the workshops should be treated also in a similar way, because students should learn that there are places where there are hierarchies and places where there are not. And they can learn that they can choose, but you know that the hierarchies are not disappearing. The big issue of the Prague Quadrennial is how to exhibit scenography, because it's obviously
endless question,
and it's an impossible issue to resolve, because even if we would exhibit the whole scenographies, if we had spaces big enough to exhibit
to rebuild
that,
it.
then we would have to exhibit it still in the context of live performance, of lighting, of sound, because the scenography by itself is not full. So in the PQ, we're over the course of decades looking for new ways how to exhibit and what to exhibit. When you exhibit photos and videos, it's documentation of the product, while if you just show models and drawings, you're showing documentation of process. So neither of those are the right solution either. In the recent years, there's more and more exhibitions that are in themselves scenographies, that are becoming stages in themselves.
So dynamic.
Yeah, we call them
live.
scenographic installations, where there's performance or audience becomes performers. But for 2015, I wanted to play more with that idea, and that's why we had the Tribes project, and it was the bodies of people, and the costumes were the artifacts, and the public space was the gallery, and it was exploration of that kind of exhibiting. And then we had this project Objects, which was a fun thing to do, because in the recent years we really focused on invisible scenographies and scenography more as a process, more as a strategy, rather than something you build and something you can only touch and see. And so it was fun to show objects, the props as you call them in the theater, and curated by Tomáš Svoboda, a Czech visual artist. And we had exhibited props in one part of the space, and then in another one we exhibited videos of people who brought these props telling a story why this prop is important. And we wanted to point to the fact that the prop by itself is not important in itself, but the story either of the person who carried it or a specific performance or a story of the performance is what makes it important. Ever since 2003, I think we were looking into scenography not only as a visual art, but also something that has other phenomenological influences on all of our senses. And that's why we looked into food as scenography, and food as a very important part of performance, and everyday performance, but also food in different places and so on, and how food in itself has many different layers that influences the senses. And we had a gallery where we had 2 or 3 performances every day, where audiences would enter and could follow the process of the making, of performing, and then they could eat the performance in the end.